In 1942, General Friedrich Paulus assumed command of the mighty German Sixth Army, a force the Wehrmacht considered nearly unbeatable. Men, tanks, artillery and trucks advanced across the Russian plains with an almost arrogant confidence, as if victory were inevitable. The ground shook with every step of the panzer tank columns, their steel tracks tearing up the earth and frozen snow as they advanced towards Stalingrad, the city that would mark the fate of thousands. The air was thick with the metallic smell of engine oil and burning gunpowder, an aroma that heralded death and destruction. The sound of engines, distant explosions and machine guns mingled with the roar of tanks, creating a brutal symphony of war that made men's hearts beat faster. Planes circled overhead, leaving trails of black smoke in the grey sky, while fighter jets prepared to attack any resistance that appeared ahead. The columns of soldiers marched between war machines that resembled iron monsters, feeling the vibration of the ground beneath their feet. Each step brought the expectation of confrontation, but also a silent tension. They knew deep down that each advance into enemy territory could cost thousands of lives. As they approached Stalingrad, the landscape changed. Fields and villages were devastated by artillery. Silos and burning houses transformed the landscape into a hell of smoke and fire. With every kilometer, the roar of war intensified. Men prepared for the urban combat they knew was coming. Tanks advanced with their machine guns at the ready. Infantry followed in tight formation, carrying rifles and grenades, advancing through the biting cold of the Russian steppe, where the wind seemed to pierce to the bone. Among them, officers shouted orders, their voices piercing the deafening sound of explosions and gunfire, trying to maintain discipline amid the approaching chaos. Despite their initial confidence, there was something in the air that no amount of training could prepare them for. Every building, every street in Stalingrad posed an invisible threat. Soviet snipers and soldiers could appear at any moment, ready to turn every advance into a massacre. The biting cold, the weight of their equipment, and the fear of the unknown began to weigh heavily on the men's shoulders, reminding them that although they believed in a swift victory, they were about to enter a nightmare of fire, blood, and ice. The Sixth Army's advance wasn't just military, it was a terrifying spectacle of power and destruction. The roar of tanks and the boom of artillery not only announced the beginning of a battle, but also foretold the inferno that would consume defenders and attackers alike. Every step was marked by determination, but also by imminent danger, and what they didn't yet know was that Stalingrad wouldn't surrender easily. What awaited them was cold, hunger, blood, and a resistance that would forever change the course of the war in the East. If you want to experience war, history like never before, with epic, bloody, and real details, subscribe now and join our legion of historians. Even before German soldiers entered Stalingrad, the city's sky began to transform into a nightmare of fire and smoke. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, launched a massive bombardment of the city's neighborhoods, factories, and warehouses. Planes flew overhead in serrated formation, leaving trails of dark smoke as they released bombs that exploded with a deafening roar, shaking buildings, shattering windows, and turning streets into veritable rivers of dust and rubble. The sound of the explosions was deafening, a continuous roar that blended twisted metal, broken wood, and shattered glass. Each detonation sent a shockwave through the ground, sending chunks of brick and concrete flying as if the earth itself was screaming. Civilians and soldiers trying to take cover in the ruins were swallowed by the chaos, engulfed in clouds of smoke and ash that burned the skin and irritated the lungs. The fire began to consume everything. Houses, factories, and warehouses became living flames, and the entire city seemed like an inferno anticipating confrontation. The smell of burning wood, heated metal, and searing flesh mixed with the biting cold of the Russian autumn, creating a suffocating atmosphere. The streets, once wide and open, were now littered with debris and craters, making every advance of the German infantry a deadly challenge. For the soldiers of the Sixth Army, the sight was both impressive and terrifying. They approached Stalingrad believing the city would fall quickly, but even from afar it was impossible to ignore the human toll of that attack. Each explosion was a warning of what was to come: hand-to-hand combat, death on all sides, and a cruel winter that would freeze bodies and hope. As the bombardment continued, the sky became a mosaic of black smoke and red flames. Soviet planes still tried to respond, but German air superiority and initial surprise ensured that the damage was nearly total. Each crumbling building created new deadly hiding places for defenders and new traps for attackers. The terrain of Stalingrad was transformed into a bloody labyrinth, where every step could be the last. The bombing wasn't just physical destruction, it was also psychological. Terror and disorientation left civilians and soldiers in panic, breaking resistance even before direct confrontation. But the Soviets, determined to protect their city, were ready to face the unimaginable. And so, as smoke rose and flames engulfed Stalingrad, the stage was set for one of the most brutal battles of World War II. First contact with Soviet defenders. When the soldiers of the Sixth Army finally reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, reality began to reveal itself far more brutal than anyone had anticipated. The city streets were occupied by determined Soviet defenders, men and women who knew every alley, every building, and every factory as if it were a part of their own lives. Ambushed snipers hid behind shattered walls, shattered windows, and piles of rubble, ready to open fire at any sign of a German advance. The initial impact was devastating. Machine guns fired from all sides, ricocheting off the walls and raising clouds of dust and shrapnel. Each advance by the German infantry cost immediate lives, and the commanders quickly realized that the city would not be taken without house-to-house, street-to-street combat. Explosions from grenades thrown from unexpected hiding places turned buildings into death traps, and the sound of men screaming in pain and fear echoed through the rubble. Factories that once produced machinery and supplies became makeshift fortresses. Soviet soldiers used abandoned tanks, weapons stockpiles, and any heavy object as barricades. Every building the Germans advanced on became a veritable inferno. Automatic weapons fire, the smell of gunpowder, and the biting cold created an almost unbreathable atmosphere. For the Sixth Army, every street conquered was a price paid in blood. The roar of German tanks seemed to dominate, but each advance was meticulously contested by the Soviets. Unexpected fire from snipers hidden in chimneys or behind destroyed doors turned the advance into a deadly game of patience, precision, and sheer physical and mental endurance. German soldiers experienced the psychological terror of an invisible enemy. At any moment, someone could emerge from a destroyed building, a basement or a pile of rubble to fire a deadly shot. The entire city seemed alive, reacting to every movement, every advance, every hesitation of the attackers. For the Soviet defenders, Stalingrad was more than a city. It was their home, their life, and their honor, and they were willing to die to prevent the invasion. As the first contact intensified, it became clear that the war in Stalingrad would be unlike any other battle on the Eastern Front. There was no room for grand open army. Maneuvers. Every step would be fought with blood and iron. Every victory would be won at the cost of human lives. What began as a confident march by the Sixth Army quickly devolved into a plunge into an urban nightmare, where every corner hid death, and every building could be the last anyone would see. As the German Sixth Army advanced through the streets of Stalingrad, the city transformed into a deadly labyrinth. Every street, every alley, and every factory was a miniature battlefield, where silence could be as lethal as machine gun fire. Soldiers engaged in house-to-house combat, a tactic that consumed both men and machines, while ruined buildings became makeshift fortresses for Soviet snipers. The smell of burning gunpowder, burning wood, and burning metal mingled with the soot and dust that rose with each explosion. The noise was deafening, incessant gunfire, exploding grenades, collapsing roofs, men screaming in pain and despair. Each German advance cost lives at every step, turning narrow streets into corridors of death. Soldiers were forced to crawl under rubble, leap over craters, and traverse partially destroyed buildings as grenades exploded beside them. A surprise shot from a Soviet sniper could cut a man down before he realized the threat. German tanks, though powerful, were confined to the narrow streets, making them easy targets for anti-tank grenades thrown from windows and basements. Urban warfare was unpredictable and chaotic. The enemy could emerge from anywhere, a broken door, an underground staircase, or even from beneath piles of rubble. Each building conquered required meticulous clearing, man by man, room by room, in combat that turned interiors into living nightmares. And as the cold cut to the bone, hunger began to sap the soldiers' strength, making it increasingly difficult to endure the chaos around them. The images of this carnage were of pure destruction: bodies strewn in the streets, damaged tanks, smoking buildings, and exhausted soldiers struggling to maintain discipline in the face of absolute terror. Stalingrad's urban combat not only destroyed the city, but also eroded the humanity of those who fought within it. For the Germans, the belief in a quick victory was beginning to crumble. Every corner was a cruel reminder that the Soviet defenders would not retreat easily. For the Soviets, the city was their home and their honor. They transformed every ruin into a bastion of resistance, making each German step a temporary conquest that cost unimaginable blood and suffering. The horror of urban combat in Stalingrad was total, a spectacle of fire, ice, death, and despair, which would transform the city into an open-air cemetery, showing everyone that this would not be just another battle, but a massacre that would be recorded in history forever. Every battle has a story worth remembering. Click subscribe and never miss a single moment of true World War II history. As urban fighting consumed Stalingrad, the cruelest, reality began to unfold. The Red Army wasn't just holding out, it was encircling. The German Sixth Army, which had advanced confidently, now found itself isolated in a deadly circle. Soviet troops, advancing from outside the city, closed the lines of communication and wooed the Germans, turning their triumphant advance into a trap of ice and iron. Suddenly, the soldiers realized there was no way out. Food and ammunition supplies began to dwindle rapidly, and the already relentless Russian cold became as deadly a threat as the gunfire ripping through the streets of Stalingrad. Every step outside their conquered positions could mean instant death, whether from enemy fire, starvation, or freezing. The siege turned the city into a prison of concrete and ruins. Tanks were trapped between destroyed buildings, unable to advance or retreat. German infantry, tired, wounded, and hungry, faced an invisible enemy in every direction. Soldiers looked at each other with fearful eyes, knowing that at any moment they could be attacked by Soviets hiding in the rubble or peering through broken windows. Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, realized the gravity of the situation. Thousands of men were surrounded, without reinforcements, without supplies, and with no hope of retreat. The confidence that had accompanied them to Stalingrad evaporated, giving way to a tense silence between officers and soldiers. Orders came, but execution became increasingly difficult as the city became a veritable labyrinth of destruction, with every street, every building, and every corner a deadly threat. The biting cold made everything even more cruel. Men without proper clothing froze, fingers and feet turning black and numb, while hunger eroded strength and resolve. Every soldier knew that it wasn't just enemy fire that could kill him. The Russian winter became a silent, invisible, relentless killer. The siege not only isolated the Sixth Army, but slowly destroyed its morale. Every explosion, every unexpected attack reinforced the feeling that they were trapped in a perfect trap. Blood, ice, and ruins surrounded them on all sides. Stalingrad ceased to be merely a military objective. It became a living hell, where survival depended on luck, courage, and almost superhuman physical and psychological endurance. The Sixth Army had gone from a conquering force to a prisoner of a city that had become a wall of blood and fire. The siege was the first step in a defeat that was predicted, not only as a military one, but as a human massacre that would be forever etched in history. The deadly winter, the desperate struggle against nature and the enemy. With the Soviet siege tightening inexorably around Stalingrad, the city, already devastated by months of brutal fighting, became a stage of unimaginable suffering, a veritable frozen hell where the line between life and death was tenuous and constantly challenged. The Russian winter, legendary for its relentless ferocity, fell upon the soldiers of the German Sixth Army with an intensity that transcended any preparation or military training. It was not just an enemy to be fought, but a primordial and overwhelming force that penetrated every fiber of their being, eroding morale and resilience. The biting, icy, and incessant winds swept through the city ruins, piercing the soldiers' worn and inadequate uniforms. Each gust was a stab of ice, penetrating the fine wool, the steel of their weapons, and exposed skin, piercing the bones with a searing, paralyzing pain. The relentless snow accumulated in irregular, treacherous drifts, transforming the cityscape into a white, hostile labyrinth. Every step the soldiers took was an arduous battle against the depth of the snow and the cold that seeped into their boots, freezing their feet and making every movement an exhausting ordeal. The cold didn't just cause discomfort, it killed silently, stealing vital energy and hope. Exhausted by the constant fighting and starving due to chronic supply shortages, the soldiers faced a terrifying duality: the Soviet enemy, visible and audible, and nature itself, invisible and omnipresent. The effects of the extreme cold manifested themselves in cruel and progressive ways. Fingers, hands, and feet, exposed to the cold for long hours, began to necrotize, losing sensation and acquiring a dark, dreadful color. Gangrene, a constant threat, meant the loss of limbs, or more often, slow, agonizing death. Faces, once marked by determination, now froze with cracked skin and purple lips. Tears, inevitable in the face of so much suffering, turned to ice crystals on the eyelids and cheeks, a silent testament to the pain. Breath, visible with each exhalation like small clouds of vapor, was a constant reminder of the life slowly fading away, a fragile breath amidst the icy vastness. You've just witnessed Stalingrad in all its brutality. To uncover every detail of other world-changing battles, subscribe now, before history fades away. Each night was indescribable torment. Temperatures plummeted to abysmal levels, often reaching 30 degrees and sometimes dropping even lower. Water, essential for life, froze in minutes, making any attempt at hydration or hygiene impossible. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and interrupted by uncontrollable shivering and the constant threat of frostbite. There was minimal comfort. Makeshift shelters in shallow trenches or the rubble of destroyed buildings offered little protection from the piercing cold. Body heat alone was insufficient to ward off the ice that clung to everything. The scarcity of supplies amplified the lethality of winter. Food and heating fuel were luxuries, almost non-existent. Desperate soldiers tried to warm themselves with whatever they could find: pieces of damp wood, fragments of furniture, or any combustible material that could be scavenged from the ruins. Combat fire, which in other circumstances would have been an ally in the offensive, was now a desperate necessity for survival. However, each grenade explosion or rifle round consumed rapidly dwindling ammunition, leaving them increasingly vulnerable, faced with the terrible choice between fighting and freezing. Winter not only added a layer of suffering, but also heightened the chaos inherent in urban warfare. Tanks, once imposing war machines, became bogged down in deep snow and slippery ice, becoming easy targets for Soviet artillery and infantry attacks. Men, weakened and disoriented, stumbled and fell, often unable to get up. Those left behind were quickly overcome by the cold, freezing to death before an enemy shot could even reach them. Every step through the icy, deserted city streets, strewn with rubble and frozen bodies, became a test of physical and mental endurance, courage and sheer luck. The cold made no distinction. Bleeding wounded froze to death within hours, their bodies hardening in the snow, while others, without visible injuries, were silently consumed by hypothermia, their hearts stopping without warning. Psychologically, winter was eroding the soldiers' morale, insidiously and relentlessly. The confidence that had buoyed the Sixth Army on its victorious march to the gates of Stalingrad melted with each freezing day, replaced by growing despair. Men witnessed comrades die from frostbite, saw the bodies of entire families massacred in the streets, and the terrifying realization that death could come from either the enemy or the cruel, omnipresent. Cold settled in their minds. Every breath was painful, every movement cost precious energy they lacked, and every attempt at resistance seemed increasingly futile in the face of the magnitude of the suffering. Hope, a resource as vital as ammunition, was running out. Stalingrad that winter ceased to be merely a military objective or a city to be conquered. It became a natural torture field, an arena where snow, wind and ice posed as weapons as deadly and effective as Soviet rifles, grenades and artillery. The Sixth Army, once a symbol of the Wehrmacht's power, efficiency and invincibility, now found itself trapped by a winter that silently killed, reminding everyone that in that desolate city, the greatest enemy was not just on the other side of the trench, but above, all around, in every snowflake that fell mercilessly upon them, in every gust of wind that howled through the ruins, and in every degree that the thermometer plummeted. It was a battle against existence itself, and nature was winning. Only true history enthusiasts understand the weight of every decision in battle. Prove you're one of them, subscribe, and follow every epic narrative. Logistical desperation, the invisible struggle for survival. As the cold bit into the soldiers' bones and the city of Stalingrad turned into a graveyard of ice and fire, the Sixth Army faced an enemy as relentless as winter and Soviet troops. Logistical desperation. With the Soviet encirclement firmly established, German supply lines were cut, making food, ammunition and fuel, precious rarities, increasingly difficult to obtain. Every missed meal, every wasted cartridge, and every liter of tank oil became a life-threatening risk, one step closer to annihilation. The Luftwaffe, the once proud German Air Force, was tasked with the nearly impossible task of delivering relief to the besieged men through an airlift of supplies. Overloaded and vulnerable transport planes crisscrossed the frigid, hostile skies, often under heavy Soviet anti-aircraft fire. It was a race against time and against the odds. Incessant snow blanketed makeshift airfields, making landings extremely dangerous. Strong winds blew aircraft off course, and the enemy lay in wait, ready to shoot down every plane laden with hope. For every successful flight that managed to deliver even a fraction of the needed supplies, many more crashed in flames or crashed into the frozen ground, turning the long-awaited aid into ash and wreckage before it even reached the starving, freezing soldiers. Goering's promise to supply the Sixth Army by air proved to be a cruel illusion, an empty promise that sealed the fate of tens of thousands of men. On the ground, the situation was one of growing desperation. The encircled troops were forced to ration food to extremes, reaching levels of deprivation that bordered on starvation. Soldiers with sunken faces and emaciated bodies gnawed on pieces of hardened, often infested bread and frozen animal remains found in the city's ruins. Hunger eroded not only muscles and physical strength, but also willpower and reasoning ability. Each day became a battle not only against the external enemy, but against one's own body, against overwhelming weakness, paralyzing cold and despair that deepened with each hour. Wounded men who, under other circumstances, could have been treated and saved in field hospitals were now left to die slowly in makeshift shelters as there was insufficient medicine, no heat to keep them warm, and no minimal medical attention to save them. The sight of comrades dying of starvation or of wounds that could be cured was a devastating blow to morale. Logistical desperation also had a direct and catastrophic impact on combat. Tanks, once the backbone of the blitzkrieg, lay immobile and abandoned amidst the snow and craters without fuel, becoming easy targets for Soviet ambushes. Heavy weapons, such as artillery and machine guns, fell silent due to lack of ammunition, leaving the infantry exposed and vulnerable. The infantry, in turn, exhausted and weakened by hunger and cold, could barely hold their positions, much less advance without suffering heavy casualties. The siege became a living prison, where every move was dangerous, every attempted attack a calculated risk of death, and every day of starvation robbed them of the ability to fight. Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, and his officers watched the deteriorating situation with agonizing helplessness. Hitler's orders, demanding that the position be held at all costs, arrived, but there was no practical means of carrying them out. Each decision carried an unbearable weight. Holding the position meant more freezing, more starvation, and more slow deaths. Attempting to break the encirclement, an operation that would require forces and supplies they did not have, could mean complete and immediate annihilation. The cold, scarcity, and psychological pressure crushed the men before the Soviets even lifted a finger. The once confident leadership was now trapped in a deadly dilemma with no apparent way out. What remained of the Sixth Army was not just an army, but a mass of exhausted, starving, and frozen men trying to resist as the city slowly consumed them. Stalingrad had ceased to be merely a military objective. It had become a death trap, where lack of supplies was almost as lethal as enemy bullets and grenades, and where each attempt at survival seemed more impossible than the last. Logistics, the science of moving and supplying an army, had failed catastrophically, and this failure was costing the lives of hundreds of thousands of men, sealing the fate of one of Nazi Germany's largest armies. The lines close, the deadly embrace of the Soviet encirclement, with the Russian winter reaching its peak of ferocity and the German Sixth Army supplies reduced to mere traces. The situation in Stalingrad became hopelessly desperate. Soviet troops, driven by iron, determination, and numerical advantage, advanced from all sides, relentlessly consolidating the siege and transforming the city into a prison of ice, ruins, and death. The Wehrmacht's lines of communication with the outside world were completely cut, sealing the fate of Paulus and his commanders, who found themselves isolated, deprived of vital reinforcements, crucial intelligence, and any additional supplies that might alleviate the suffering of their men. Total isolation made every decision a matter of life or death, burdened with crushing weight. German officers, once confident in their maneuverability and strategy, realized with growing anguish that any offensive to break the encirclement or an organized retreat would be a near impossible task. The tanks, which should have been the spearhead of any counterattack, lay frozen amid craters and destroyed streets, out of fuel and ammunition, becoming easy targets for Soviet artillery and tank hunters. The soldiers, weakened by hunger, exhaustion, and the paralyzing cold, could barely hold their defensive positions, and each position gained was only temporary, costing more lives than any strategic gain could justify. With each passing day, the hope of external rescue diminished, replaced by the certainty of a tragic end. The ruined streets and buildings, which had once been the scene of intense and bloody fighting, now became silent, deadly traps. German soldiers attempting to move through the rubble could be attacked at any moment by patient, camouflaged Soviet snipers hiding in shattered windows or behind piles of bricks. Grenades were thrown from unexpected corners, and planned explosions of unstable buildings turned escape routes into dead ends. Every step away from a safe position could mean immediate death. A sniper bullet, a grenade fragment, or the collapse of a precarious structure. The city, in its destruction, had become an enemy as lethal as the Soviets themselves. The morale of the Sixth Army, already shattered by winter and shortages, began to crumble irreversibly. The unrelenting cold, excruciating hunger, and the psychological pressure of being completely surrounded created an environment where fear was a constant, a shadow that loomed over every man. Soldiers who had once marched with the arrogance of victory now looked at each other with quiet desperation, their eyes reflecting the terrifying realization that survival no longer depended solely on skill, courage, or training, but on almost divine luck, a miraculous intervention that seemed increasingly unlikely. Camaraderie gave way to isolation, and discipline, once ironclad, began to crumble under the weight of suffering. The psychological pressure increased exponentially with each passing day. Soldiers watched their comrades freeze to death, starve to death in their arms, or be mercilessly slaughtered by enemy fire. Even the most experienced and hardened officers began to feel the crushing weight of the siege, the sense of claustrophobia, and the inevitability of defeat. Every attempt to maintain discipline and order was undermined by extreme fatigue, the soul-gnawing cold, and the growing despair that spread like a contagious disease. The city of Stalingrad, with its ghostly ruins and frozen streets, had become a deadly prison, where every move was calculated with the constant fear of instant death, and where the will to fight was replaced by the simple, desperate will to survive. The lines surrounding the Sixth Army were not only physical barriers of Soviet troops and weaponry, but also insurmountable psychological barriers. The men were trapped in a deadly embrace between enemy fire and the relentless ice, without any hope of reinforcements, supplies, or an escape route. Isolation was not just strategic, a military tactic, but a sentence of prolonged suffering, a relentless grip that crushed body and mind, robbing dignity and humanity. This encirclement, which would become one of the darkest and most tragic episodes of World War II, foreshadowed not only the defeat of an army, but the collapse of an ambition and the beginning of the end for the Third Reich in Eastern Europe. Stalingrad would become synonymous with sacrifice, resistance, and for the Wehrmacht, an unprecedented catastrophe. The depth of suffering in deadly winter. The winter of 1942-1943 in Stalingrad was not just a climatic phenomenon, it was a weapon of mass destruction as effective as any artillery bombardment or air raid. The average temperature, already brutal, often dropped to 30 degrees C, but in peaks of nature's fury it could reach 40 degrees or even 50 degrees. At these extremes, simply exposing skin for a few minutes could result in third-degree frostbite. The soldiers, many of them from milder climates in Western Europe, were ill-equipped to face such adversity. Their thin wool uniforms and stiff leather boots were a cruel joke compared to the fury of the Russian winter. With each step, snow accumulated, melted slightly, with body heat, and then froze again, turning the boots into blocks of ice that crushed the feet, causing blisters, open wounds, and invariably gangrene. The phenomenon of trench foot, a painful and debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp and cold, was endemic. Soldiers' feet would swell, become numb, and then become gangrenous, requiring amputations performed in poor sanitary conditions, often without anesthesia, in makeshift underground shelters that served as field hospitals. The pain was excruciating, and infection was a near-certain death sentence. Beyond the physical suffering, the psychological impact was devastating. The constant battle against cold, hunger, and the enemy created a state of profound mental exhaustion. Sleep deprivation was a continual torture. The fear of freezing during rest was as great as the fear of a Soviet attack. Many soldiers developed a cold apathy, an indifference to their own fate and that of their comrades, a defense mechanism against the unbearable pain. Hallucinations caused by hunger and cold were common, with men reporting visions of sumptuous banquets or their families at home, only to be cruelly brought back to the brutal reality of Stalingrad. Hope, a resource as vital as ammunition, was running out, replaced by a dark and resigned despair. Winter was not just a setting, it was an active player in the tragedy, a silent executioner that reaped lives as efficiently as bullets and grenades. The illusion of the airlift and the reality of starvation, Hermann Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe would be able to supply the Sixth Army by air, was perhaps one of the greatest and cruelest illusions of the Battle of Stalingrad. The reality on the ground was overwhelmingly complex and relentlessly brutal. The Luftwaffe's transport capacity was severely limited, and the adverse weather conditions, constant blizzards, high winds and freezing temperatures, made every flight a suicide mission. Makeshift airfields like Pitomnik and Gumrak were constantly under Soviet artillery fire and were often rendered inoperable by snow and ice. German pilots, many of them young and inexperienced, faced not only the enemy in the air and on the ground, but also the fury of nature. The aircraft loss rate was alarming, and each downed plane meant not only the loss of valuable aircrew, but also the destruction of desperately needed supplies. The few supplies that did arrive were a drop in the ocean of the Sixth Army's needs. Instead of the promised 500 tons per day, the actual average delivery barely reached 100 tons, and often much less. This meant that a soldier's daily ration, already insufficient, was reduced to crumbs. Hunger became a constant, a searing pain that gnawed at the flesh and spirit. Desperate soldiers resorted to extreme measures to survive. Horses, which had been an integral part of the army's logistics, were slaughtered, and their meat, often frozen and tough, was consumed. Dogs and cats, which roamed the ruins, also became food sources. There were reports of cannibalism among the most desperate, though these cases were rare and usually concealed. Severe malnutrition led to drastic weight loss, muscle weakness, night blindness, and a terrible susceptibility to disease. Typhus, dysentery, and influenza spread rapidly amid unsanitary conditions and the soldiers' lack of stamina, claiming lives that the enemy had not been able to take. The lack of fuel paralyzed not only the tanks, but also the transport vehicles and generators that could provide even a modicum of heat. Ammunition, severely rationed, meant that soldiers often had to face Soviet attacks with silenced weapons, relying only on bayonets and desperate courage. With each passing day, the Sixth Army's combat capability diminished, not for lack of will, but for lack of means. The logistical desperation was not just a failure in the supply chain, it was a slow and inevitable death sentence, a testament to the arrogance of the German command and the relentless resilience of the Soviet encirclement, the deadly embrace of the siege and the breakdown of morality. The closing of the lines around the Sixth Army at Stalingrad was not just a tactical maneuver, it was a methodical and brutal strangulation that sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. Operation Uranus, launched by the Soviets in November 1942, was a masterstroke, a rapidly closing pincer trapping the Sixth Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army in a gigantic pocket. The speed and effectiveness of the encirclement took the German command by surprise, which underestimated the Soviet capacity to mount an offensive on such a scale and in such adverse weather conditions. The front line, which had previously stretched for hundreds of kilometers, now shrank into an ever-shrinking perimeter under constant bombardment and infantry attacks. The isolation was almost absolute. Hitler's attempts to prohibit any retreat based on a fanatical belief in victory and a refusal to give up an inch of ground, doomed the Sixth Army. With each passing day, the distance to the nearest German lines increased, and hope for a relief force, such as Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Operation Winter Storm, diminished. When Manstein attempted to break out of the encirclement, his forces were exhausted and under-equipped, and Soviet resistance was fierce. The Sixth Army, for its part, was too weakened to attempt a breakthrough, a move Paulus considered suicidal without adequate supplies and fuel. Lack of coordination and the stubbornness of the German High Command ensured that the trap became inescapable. Inside the bag, life became a hellish existence. The city, already a field of ruins, was a maze of rubble, craters, and destroyed buildings that offered little protection from the cold and enemy fire. Every street, every basement, every pile of bricks became a combat point. Soviet snipers like Vasily Zaitsev became legends, terrorizing German soldiers and sapping their morale. Rat warfare, as urban combat was known, was a battle of nerves, where death could come from any direction at any moment. The constant threat of being flanked, ambushed, or hit by an invisible mortar created a state of paranoia and mental exhaustion. The psychological impact of the siege was perhaps the most devastating. The feeling of abandonment, of being forgotten and sacrificed by a distant command, eroded loyalty and discipline. German radio reports, which spoke of the imminent victory and strategic retreat, contrasted sharply with the reality of hunger, cold, and death the soldiers were experiencing. Soviet propaganda, on the other hand, was relentless, broadcasting messages of surrender and the promise of humane treatment, which for many in their desperation began to seem a more attractive option than certain death. Discipline, once a pillar of the Wehrmacht, began to disintegrate. Deserters, though few, began to appear, and silent. Insubordination spread. The sight of comrades frozen in their positions, their eyes open and empty, or of bodies mutilated by artillery, transformed men into empty shells, devoid of hope and the will to fight. The siege of Stalingrad was not just a military defeat, it was a humanitarian and psychological catastrophe of epic proportions. The Sixth Army, once the spearhead of the Nazi war machine, was crushed not only by Soviet brute force, but by the lethal combination of winter, starvation, logistical failure, and psychological isolation. Paulus's final surrender on January 31st, 1943, against Hitler's express orders, marked the end of one of the bloodiest battles in history and the turning point of World War II in the East. The city of Stalingrad, with its ruins and its dead, became a grim monument to the futility of war and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the most extreme adversity. The nightmare of the frozen streets. With the encirclement complete, Stalingrad became a living nightmare of ice, fire, and death. The streets, covered in snow and rubble, became battlefields where every step could mean a soldier's last breath. The Sixth Army, already weakened by cold and hunger, faced relentless attacks from Soviet troops who knew every street, every building, and every corner like the back of their hands. The ruined houses became makeshift fortresses. Soviet snipers emerged from broken windows or the shadows of destroyed corridors, firing with deadly accuracy. Grenade explosions tore down walls and hurled chunks of brick and wood at the Germans, crushing and wounding them indiscriminately. Tanks parked between narrow streets were attacked with anti-tank grenades and concentrated fire, making every advance a calculated suicide. The biting cold remained relentless. Soldiers with inadequate uniforms found their hands and feet freezing, exhausted bodies trembling uncontrollably, and their breath forming clouds of steam in the frigid air. The winter silence was interrupted by gunshots, explosions, and screams of pain. Every corner, every open door, every stairwell became a stage for death and absolute chaos. Hunger sapped the men's strength, making it difficult even to lift weapons or carry the wounded. Soldiers struggled to eat stale bread scraps or minimal rations as their bodies demanded ever more energy. The wounded, left unattended, died slowly, freezing or bleeding to their last breath. The physical horror combined with the psychological. Men watched comrades freeze, be shot, or go mad under the extreme pressure. The frozen streets became a maze of suffering and destruction. Every building conquered was only temporary. Every advance cost precious lives, and a sense of helplessness gripped even the most seasoned. What was once a quick campaign turned into a prolonged urban massacre, where survival depended on courage, luck, and sheer physical and mental endurance. The nightmare of the frozen streets wasn't just combat, it was the destruction of humanity. Cold, fire, hunger, and the combined enemy created daily torment, transforming each hour into a desperate struggle for life. Stalingrad thus became a living graveyard, an urban hell where each man learned the brutal way that in war there is no room for error. As winter wore on and the encirclement tightened, the divisions of the Sixth Army began to crumble one by one. What had once been a powerful and disciplined force now became fragmented, exhausted, and starving units fighting desperately to simply survive. Soviet artillery constantly pounded strategic points while coordinated infantry attacks pressed the Germans from all directions. Cold and hunger consumed the soldiers as much as enemy fire. Each division lost men daily, killed by bullets, grenades, explosions, extreme cold, or disease brought on by suffering and supply shortages. Desperate officers tried to reorganize shattered units, but military discipline began to dissolve under the weight of exhaustion, fear, and constant death. Tanks got stuck in the icy streets or were destroyed by precise Soviet strikes, while infantry tried to advance through smoldering rubble. Each building captured was only temporary, and the soldiers realized that the city, once thought of as an objective, now became a living enemy, full of ambushes, traps, and dead bodies strewn across the streets. The number of dead and wounded became overwhelming. Soldiers fell frozen or wounded beyond help, and each survivor carried not only the physical burden, but also the trauma of witnessing their comrades being destroyed before their eyes. Communication between divisions became increasingly difficult, and the feeling of isolation and helplessness grew with each passing hour. Paulus watched helplessly as his divisions, which should have been the Wehrmacht's elite force, crumbled in a silent, continuous massacre. The advance that had once seemed triumphant was now nothing more than a desperate effort to hold some ground, while the Soviet encirclement tightened like an iron fist around the Sixth Army. The fall of the German divisions was not just a matter of numbers, but of morale, strength, and hope. Each unit destroyed represented not only dead soldiers, but the slow death of confidence, strategy, and the very ability to fight. Stalingrad had turned German military pride into ruins, and each step forward became more difficult, bloodier, and more desperate. What had once seemed like a swift victory now turned out to be a prolonged massacre, a constant struggle against an enemy that knew every detail of the city, every movement of the encircled troops, and every weakness of the frozen and starving men. The Sixth Army was slowly dying, and the city, cold and unforgiving, silently watched each defeat. Breakup attempts. As the Soviet encirclement deepened, Paulus realized that remaining passive would mean the slow death of the entire Sixth Army. Desperate, he ordered several attempts to break through the enemy lines, moves intended to open a corridor for escape, supplies, and reorganization. But what began as hope quickly turned to tragedy. German soldiers, starving, frozen, and exhausted, marched toward the Soviet lines, knowing they were almost certain to die. Each advance was met by concentrated artillery and machine gun fire. Grenades exploded all around, bricks and rubble flew through the air, and each trench gained was quickly lost to the superior numbers and terrain. Knowledge of the Soviet defenders. The psychological toll was devastating. Men who had once marched confidently now advanced in fear, eyes wide, trembling with cold and exhaustion. comrades were shot down beside them before they could even react. Tanks got stuck or were destroyed, leaving soldiers isolated in open ground where every movement was an invitation to death. Attempts to break the siege were nearly suicidal. Communications failed, reinforcements failed to arrive, and the Luftwaffe failed to provide sufficient support. Each failure increased hopelessness, and morale, already extremely low, plummeted even further. Men began to question orders, refuse movement, and give in to exhaustion and cold, knowing that the outcome would depend not on courage, but on luck. Paulus watched helplessly as his orders turned into massacres. The hope of saving part of the army vanished with each failed attack. Men froze, starved, or were mercilessly slaughtered, and the dream of escaping the encirclement became increasingly illusory. The city of Stalingrad, cold and devastated, watched silently as a besieged army struggled desperately, consuming every attempt at resistance in blood and ruins. These final offensives not only failed, but consumed the last of the Sixth Army's strength. What remained of the German force became increasingly fragmented, weakened, and emotionally shattered. Rage, fear, and exhaustion turned each soldier into a shadow of their former self, prisoners of a siege that forgave no mistakes, weakness, or despair. With the siege tightening, the winter relentless, and attempts to break out failing, the Sixth Army's morale began to crumble. What had once been a disciplined and confident force now became exhausted, hungry, and terrified men struggling to simply survive. Every soldier felt hopelessness seep into their bones, mixed with the biting cold that seemed to freeze not only the body but also the soul. The psychological impact was devastating. Men watched their comrades freeze or starve to death, heard the screams of pain echoing through the destroyed streets, and felt their helplessness in the face of the relentless siege. The once rigid military discipline began to crumble. Some soldiers refused orders, others moved mechanically, fighting just to stay alive another day. Every moment of respite became a struggle against fear, exhaustion, and hopelessness. The units were fragmented. Officers tried to maintain some control, but the divisions were so weakened that they were unable to coordinate attacks or even organize minimal defenses. Soldiers wandered among destroyed buildings, snow-covered streets, and rubble, at the mercy of the enemy and nature. Hunger gnawed at muscles and minds, making every movement painful and every decision impossible. The feeling of psychological isolation was total. The city, once a strategic objective, became a living enemy, every street and every corner representing mortal danger. Men became paranoid, expecting attacks from every shadow, every ruin, while the cold continued to silently kill all around. The hope of survival, which had still kept them moving, began to slowly disappear, replaced by fear and resignation. Paulus, isolated in his command, watched his orders get lost in the chaos as each unit disappeared into bloody fragments. The Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had become a mass of desperate survivors, defeated not only by the enemy, but by hunger, cold, and the psychological horror that consumed each of them. The collapse of morale wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Men who could fight were transformed into shadows, powerless, frozen, wounded, and starving. Every hour of combat became torture, and every night spent in the frozen ruins a cruel reminder that the city of Stalingrad spared no one. Defeat, slow and inevitable, began to loom like a huge shadow over the Sixth Army, setting the stage for what was to come, the bloody and complete end of the encirclement. The unexpected surrender. After months of siege, extreme cold, hunger, and incessant fighting, Paulus's Sixth Army was reaching its limit of endurance. Men who had once marched confidently were now shadows of their former selves, wounded, frozen, starving, and emotionally shattered. Every corner of Stalingrad had become a monument to suffering, and every survivor carried in their eyes the memory of dead friends and the horror they had experienced. Paulus, aware that further orders were futile and that any attempt to break out would turn into a complete massacre, made the most difficult decision of his career: surrender. For many soldiers, surrender was unimaginable. The Wehrmacht had never faced such a collapse in the face of a besieged city, but the reality was inescapable. Continuing to fight meant dying ingloriously, consumed by cold, hunger, or enemy fire. The last few hours were silent and heavy. German soldiers left their positions with trembling hands, marching to surrender, while Soviet soldiers watched them, prepared to ensure their surrender was complete. Their dirty, torn uniforms, covered in blood and snow, told stories of desperate battles. The ground was strewn with rubble, bodies, and the wreckage of destroyed weapons and vehicles, visual proof of the hell that had consumed Stalingrad. The act of surrender was both humiliating and life-saving. The survivors were too exhausted to fight, but still alive, ready to be taken prisoner, every step away. From the battle lines was heavy with silence and despair, reminding everyone that the city, cold and unforgiving, had defeated the Sixth Army without mercy. As Paulus officially surrendered, the magnitude of the defeat became clear. More than 90,000 men were captured, and thousands died in the final days of fighting. The city, though devastated, remained standing, a silent witness to a victory that had cost an incalculable human price. Stalingrad had proven that not even the most powerful army could subdue the will of a people defending their land, their honor, and their lives to the last. The unexpected surrender marked the end of Germany's dream of a swift victory. The Sixth Army, once a symbol of strength and discipline, had been destroyed, consumed by Stalingrad, cold, hunger, and the enemy's tireless resistance. And so, the city became an eternal landmark of the brutality, courage, and horror of World War II. The fate of the survivors. After the surrender, the survivors of the Sixth Army found no relief. They found another kind of torment. Exhausted, starving, and freezing troops were taken as prisoners to Soviet camps, where survival became a new daily battle. Each man bore visible and invisible scars, wounded bodies, frozen hands and feet, eyes marked by terror, and the constant memory of dead or missing comrades. Conditions in the camps were extreme. Makeshift tents covered in snow, minimal food rations, and the cold that continued to corrode bodies and minds, all contributed to almost unimaginable suffering. Soldiers who had survived the bloody fighting, bombings, and winter of Stalingrad now faced disease, hunger, and prolonged exhaustion. Each day was a fight for life, often won only by luck. The psychological impact was devastating. Men witnessed daily deaths around them, lost friends, and suffered the constant pain of hunger and cold. Hope of returning home dwindled with each passing week, and the trauma of the siege remained vivid in every memory. The roar of artillery, the fire of shells, the screams of the wounded, and the deathly silence of winter. Many would never mentally overcome the experience, carrying the horrors of Stalingrad with them for the rest of their lives. For Germany, the loss was monumental. More than 90,000 prisoners meant the near-complete destruction of the Sixth Army, and the psychological and military impact would reverberate for years. The defeat was not only strategic, but also symbolic. It demonstrated that not even the most disciplined army could overcome the combination of courage, determination, hostile territory, and deadly winter. Stalingrad had consumed men, weapons, morale, and hope. The fate of the survivors became a cruel reminder of the brutality of war. Conquering the city was impossible without paying an unacceptable human price. Every step taken outside the front lines, every moment of survival, was marked by cold, blood, and the memory of a nightmare that would remain forever etched in history. The bloody legacy of Stalingrad became forever a symbol of the brutality of war and human determination. The defeat of Paulus's Sixth Army was not only military, but also human, psychological, and moral. Thousands of soldiers died, Thousands more were captured. Thousands more were forever scarred by the horror they experienced. The city consumed men, machines, and hopes, transforming winter and fire into weapons as lethal as any soldier. The legacy of Stalingrad is one of absolute suffering. Destroyed streets, ruined buildings, bodies scattered among the snow and rubble, and the memory of men who fought to exhaustion, froze, starved to death, or were cut down by enemy machine guns and grenades. Every step of the Sixth Army, every attempt to advance, every attempt to survive, became a bitter lesson in the limits of human endurance and military pride. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was a demonstration of the strength of determined defense, strategy, and courage in the face of total destruction. Every building held, every street defended, and every life sacrificed contributed to a monumental triumph, showing the world that not even the most powerful army could subdue a people willing to fight for their land. For the world, the bloody legacy of Stalingrad is a reminder that war is absolute in its destructiveness. It's not just about strategies or victories, but about human lives crushed by cold, hunger, fire, and fear. It's a testament to resilience, but also to horror, to what man is capable of enduring and the terrible price paid for ambition and pride. Stalingrad remains an eternal landmark in military history, a victory that cost more than numbers could express, a city that turned men into shadows, armies into corpses, and hope into bloody memory. Every winter, every bullet, every ruin, and every survivor is part of this legacy, reminding future generations of the fury of war and human strength in the face of the impossible. And so Paulus's Sixth Army became a symbol of the price of military arrogance and the ruthless determination of Stalingrad, leaving an epic story of courage, suffering, and death that would echo forever in the annals of World War II. Decades have passed, but Stalingrad remains vivid in the collective memory as a testament to the brutality of war and human resilience. Every destroyed street, every ruined building, and every lost body has become a symbol of sacrifice and suffering, reminding the world that war spares no one, neither heroes nor villains. The horrors experienced by the soldiers of the Sixth Army and the Soviet defenders became lessons in courage, resilience, and the limits of military ambition. Historians, descendants, and visitors look back at the city, now Volgograd, and realize that the horrors of the past shaped the present, teaching that the determination of a people can change the course of history. Memorials, books, films, and studies of Stalingrad keep alive the memory of those who fought and died. Every snow melted last winter, every shot fired in the frozen streets, and every prisoner who endured the siege continues to tell the story of a battle that redefined World War II. The memory of Stalingrad is not only military, but also human. It recalls the cost of war, the courage that flourishes even in the most extreme conditions, and the weight of suffering that every soldier and civilian had to endure. It is a legacy of pain, heroism, and resilience, an eternal landmark that continues to echo in the heart of world history.